Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. We are continuing on with the story of Thumama ibn Uthal and his conversion to Islam. The narration mentions that he went out near a date palm tree and took a bath and embraced Islam. It's as if it was known amongst the people that when you embrace Islam, you take a bath. And this is the general practice. Even today, we say that any non-Muslim who is embracing Islam needs to take a bath. There's just a difference of opinion as to whether it is obligatory or not. And most scholars say it is obligatory, some say it is not obligatory. There is a narration in which the Prophet ordered a non-Muslim who embraced Islam to take a bath, so he gave him a verbal order. Some scholars say that, look, many people embraced Islam. If that has been the case, then it ought to be the case that we have many narrations where the Prophet orders people to take a bath. Yet how come we only have just one narration? However, we say that even if we have only one narration, that ought to be enough for us. And that is the philosophy in our ahkam or rulings which we follow, that just one authentic evidence is enough. We do not require a multitude of narrations. And it also, just thinking about it, makes sense, because when a person embraces Islam, then he spiritually purifies himself, because the mushrikun are najas, as the Quran says, meaning their beliefs and actions are najas. But when you embrace Islam, you have purified your beliefs and henceforth your actions as well. So it only stands to reason that you should purify your physical body as well. After he took the Shahada, he tells the Prophet that your face was the most hated to me, your deen was the most hated, and your city of Al-Madinah was the most hated. Face, deen and city, the most hated to him, but now all three have become the most beloved to him. Just look at this sudden change, which Iman in your heart brings about. What you love and what you hate is dictated by your Iman. He also deprived the people of Makkah from wheat, because they used to import wheat into Makkah from Al-Yamama. It is also reported that the people of Makkah appealed to the Prophet to order Thumama to give them the wheat, and the Prophet acceded to their demand out of his mercy, alayhi salatu wasalam. It was a similar case with Amr ibn al-As, the husband of Zainab, the daughter of the Prophet. He was a non-Muslim first, and he embraced Islam afterwards, and the Prophet returned his daughter Zainab to him without renewing the marriage. And he said that in the days of his kufr, if he could overpower the Prophet, he would have killed him, and that the face of the Prophet was the most hated to him. But now it's the complete opposite. So again, with Amr ibn al-As and Thumama ibn Uthal, we have a parallel situation where that which is hated to you becomes the most beloved to you. And this is the effect of your Iman in the heart. It completely changes the way you view the world. Let's take the next chapter about expelling the Yahud and the Nasara from the Arabian Peninsula. From Abu Hurairah, the Prophet and the companions went to the Yahud. The Prophet told them, Ya ma'ashara Yahud, aslimu taslamu. O group of Yahud, embrace Islam, you will have security. And they replied, Qad ballaghta ya Abul Qasim. You have conveyed the message to us, O Abu al-Qasim. And the Prophet said, ذَلِكَ أُرِيدُ أَسْلِمُوا تَسْلَمُوا. That is what I want. Become Muslim and you will have safety. And they replied the same way, you have conveyed. And so this exchange happened 2 more times, or 3 times in total. The Prophet saying, this is what I want, and they're replying, you have conveyed the message. And on the 3rd, the Prophet said, know that the earth belongs to Allah and the Messenger, and I want to expel you from this land. So whoever has any wealth with him, then let him sell it. Otherwise, the earth belongs to Allah and His Messenger. We find from this narration that the Prophet is warning the Yahud that he will expel them. He did not immediately expel them without giving them notice. We find here that the Yahud did not embrace Islam. They simply said, you have conveyed the message to us. So clearly they were stubborn. Another narration from Ibn Umar, he says that the Yahud from Banu Nadir and Banu Qurayza fought against the Prophet, and the Prophet expelled Banu Nadir and allowed Banu Qurayza to stay until they too fought against the Prophet. Then he killed their men, meaning Banu Qurayza, and distributed their women and children and properties amongst the Muslims, except some of them had joined the Prophet, and he granted them security. The Prophet turned out all the Yahud of Medina, Banu Qaynuqa', who were the tribe of Abdullah ibn Salam, and the Yahud of Banu Haritha, and every other Yahudi who was in Al-Madinah was turned out from it. This narration is to be understood that the Prophet turned out most of the Yahud, but not all of them, because we know when the Prophet died, his chainmail was with a Yahudi as a rahan, as a pledge, for some food which he had bought. All these tribes of the Yahud, Banu Nadir, Banu Qurayza, Banu Qaynuqa', Banu Haritha, all of these tribes proved treacherous to the Prophet ﷺ. The next chapter, again about expelling the Yahud and Nasara out of the peninsula. From Umar ibn al-Khattab, he heard the Prophet ﷺ say, لَأُخْرِجَنَّ الْيَهُودَ وَالنَّصَارَى مِنْ جَزِيرَةِ الْعَرَبِ حَتَّى لَا أَدَعَهْ إِلَّا مُسْلِمًا. I will expel the Yahud and Nasara from the Arabian Peninsula so as only to leave Muslims. We take from the narration that it is not permissible for the Yahud and Nasara to take residence in the Arabian Peninsula. However, they are allowed to come in for trade purposes or for work purposes, but they are not allowed to stay indefinitely. And this is because the Arabian Peninsula is the central place of the Islamic State, and so the Yahud and Nasara would be a hindrance to the organization of an Islamic society. Otherwise, we do know that the Yahud and Nasara can be a dhimmi citizen, but that would not be in the Arabian Peninsula, it would be outside the Arabian Peninsula. Let's take a look at the next chapter about killing those in breach of trust. From Abu Sa'id al-Khudri, he says the people of Banu Qurayza surrendered and they decided to accept the decision which Sa'ad ibn Mu'adh would make about them. So they did not accept the decision of the Prophet. So the Prophet acceded to their demand and brought Sa'ad ibn Mu'adh. He came riding a donkey because he was injured in the Battle of the Trench. And when he approached the masjid, the Prophet said to the Ansar, قُومُوا إِلَى سَيِّدِكُمْ, stand up to receive your leader. He told Sa'ad that Banu Qurayza have surrendered to your decision. Sa'ad said, you will kill their fighters, and as for their women and children, you will take them as prisoners of war. The Prophet said, قَضَيْتَ بِحُكْمِ اللَّهِ, you have judged with the judgment of Allah. Let's take some points of benefit. The Prophet says to his companions, stand up to your leader. Standing up for someone is of three types. Firstly, you stand up when your leader is sitting down, and this is imitating the Faris, and it is prohibited. Standing up for someone as he approaches you as a sign of respect for him or them is permissible. The Prophet himself did it for the delegation of Hawazin. When they came as Muslims, he stood up for them. And as for standing up to receive somebody, as in this narration here, then this is permissible if that person is worthy of it. So if he's a leader of sorts, or a ruler, or an imam. The Prophet also ordered to stand up for a janazah when it passes by, because it is not fitting that a janazah passes by and the Muslim treats it as if it was anything else. The Prophet ﷺ taught us, إِنَّ لِلْمَوْتِ فَزَعًا, that maut or death has a fright to it. فَإِذَا رَأَيْتُمُ الْجَنَازَةَ فَقُومُوا, so when you see a janazah, then stand up, out of respect and veneration, not for the person who is dead necessarily, because it could even be a kafir, but for this whole idea of death, that you take it seriously. What is emphatically forbidden when it comes to matters like these is to expect others to stand up for you. Because of the hadith, مَنْ سَرَّهُ أَنْ يَتَمَثَّلَ لَهُ الرِّجَالِ فَلْيَتَبَوَّأْ مَقْعَدَهُ مِنَ النَّارِ. Whoever is pleased that other men should stand up for him, then let him take his seat in the fire. This hadith is in the Sunan. Now Sa'ad ibn Mu'adh was an ally of Banu Qurayza, but because of their treachery, he was injured and was going to die, only he made dua to Allah Jalla wa Ala to let him live long enough so that he could exact revenge on Banu Qurayza, or at least he could see their destruction. And so this is exactly what happened. Otherwise, the wound which he sustained in the Battle of Khandaq should have killed him, but it did not, because Allah delayed him. And it is ironic then that he should give the decision to kill the treacherous tribe of Banu Qurayza, and that Banu Qurayza should accept his decision. In the same chapter we find another narration where in the Battle of the Khandaq, a man from the Quraysh named Ibn al-Ariqah shot an arrow at Sa'ad which pierced the artery in the middle of his forearm. This would have been a fatal wound, because if your artery is pierced, then you will have severe blood loss. The Prophet pitched a tent for Sa'ad in the masjid and would inquire about him from close proximity. When the Prophet returned from the battle, laid down his arms, and took a bath, Jibreel ﷺ appeared to the Prophet whilst the Prophet was removing dust from his hair, and Jibreel said, "You have laid down your weapons. By Allah, we have not yet laid down our weapons. So march against them." The Prophet asked, "Where?" And Jibreel told him, "Towards Banu Qurayza." And so he fought them until they surrendered. And then they asked the Prophet, "Let Sa'ad be the arbitrator." But of course Sa'ad was injured because of the treachery of Banu Qurayza in aiding and abetting the mushrikeen of the Arab to fight against the Muslims in the Battle of the Trench, the Battle of the Khandaq. Let us take the next chapter about making a choice between two decisions. From Abdullah, who says that he returned from the Battle of Ahzab, which was the trench, and the Prophet gave them an order that nobody must make the Dhuhr prayer except in the land of Banu Qurayza, because after the Battle of Ahzab they had to go and fight Banu Qurayza because of their treachery, as we just learnt in the previous narration, where Jibreel gave the order to the Prophet, "Do not lay down your arms yet, you have to fight Banu Qurayza because of their treachery." So anyway, they were off to the land of Banu Qurayza. Some people were afraid that the time of Dhuhr would end, and so they made Dhuhr before reaching the land of Banu Qurayza. And others said, "We are only going to pray Dhuhr in the land of Banu Qurayza because that's what the Prophet ordered, even if it means praying outside the time of Dhuhr." When the Prophet got to know about this dispute, he did not blame any one of them. Now in this narration, Dhuhr is mentioned, but in the narration of Al-Bukhari, Asr is mentioned. And because Al-Bukhari is more authentic, it makes more sense to go with that narration. We say that the prayer in question was the Asr prayer. This is a typical narration which is quoted to prove that ijtihad cannot be rebuked. And indeed that is the case. We have already taken the hadith when a mujtahid makes his ijtihad and arrives at the wrong answer, he has one reward. But if he arrives at the right answer, he has two rewards. But that does not mean that both of their decisions in this narration were correct. One party was correct. But which side is correct? Well, Allah Jalla wa Ala says, إِنَّ الصَّلَاةَ كَانَتْ عَلَى الْمُؤْمِنِينَ كِتَابًا مَوْقُوتًا. The prayer is on fixed times. If we go with the ones who prayed after the time of Asr, then this would create a contradiction between the evidences. However, if we go with the ones who prayed during the time of Asr but before they reached Banu Qurayza, then this does not create a contradiction. And the way to interpret the statement of the Prophet would be, he's telling them to only pray Asr at the place of Qurayza, just in order to make them hurry up. And so like this we can reconcile between the evidences, and a reconciliation of evidences is better than a contradiction of evidence. Let's take the next chapter. Returning the gifts of the Ansar by the Muhajirin when they grew richer because of the conquests. Anas ibn Malik narrates that the Muhajirun came to Mecca when they had nothing, but the Ansar, however, possessed lands and date palms. The Ansar divided their wealth with the Muhajirin, and the Muhajirin were to work on the date palm trees and receive a portion of the fruits. The mother of Anas ibn Malik, who was Sulaym, was also the mother of Abdullah ibn Talha, who was the uterine brother of Anas ibn Malik. Sulaym gave some date palm trees to the Prophet, who in turn bestowed them on Ayman, who was a servant woman whom the Prophet freed, and was also the mother of Osama ibn Zayd. After the Battle of Khaybar, the Prophet returned to Medina. The Muhajirun returned to the Ansar all of the gifts which they had received. Anas says that the Prophet returned to my mother, Sulaym, her date palm tree, and gave to Ayman in return the date palm trees from his orchard. Ibn Jihaad says that Ayman was the mother of Osama ibn Zayd, who was the servant girl of Abdullah ibn Abdul Muttalib, and she hailed from Abyssinia, current-day Ethiopia. He says when Amina, the Prophet's mother, gave birth to the Prophet after the death of the Prophet's father, Ayman used to nurse the Prophet until he grew up. The Prophet later on freed her and married her to Zayd ibn Haritha. She died 5 months after the death of the Prophet. Well, we find that the asl, or the default rule about gifts, is that they are yours to keep and you do not need to return them. But they did so because they wanted to be independent and not rely on anyone else. Let's take the next chapter about food found in the land of the enemy. From Abdullah ibn Mughaffal, He says he found a bag containing fat on the day of Khaybar, the Battle of Khaybar. He says, I held on to it and I said, لا أعطي اليوم أحدا من هذا شيئا. I will not give anyone today from this. He says, I turned around and I saw the Prophet smiling. We ask a question, is this not ghulul, taking from the war booty? The answer is, when it comes to these consumable items like food and fruits and so on, then you can take from it and it is not ghulul. Let us take the next chapter about the Prophet's letter to Hiraql, calling him to Islam. This is a long narration. Ibn Abbas narrates, who learnt it from Abu Sufyan. He says that I went out on trade, this is Abu Sufyan reporting, during a period of time when the Mushrikeen were at peace with the Muslimin. He says, whilst I was in Syria, the letter of the Prophet was handed over to Hiraql, who was the emperor of the Rum. The letter was brought by a man called Dihya al-Kalbi, who gave it to the governor of Busra, who gave it on to Hiraql. On receiving the letter, Hiraql asked, is there anyone from the people of this man who is claiming to be a prophet? And Abu Sufyan says that I was called, along with a few others from Quraysh. We sat before him, and he asked, which of you has a closer kinship to this man claiming to be a prophet? Abu Sufyan said that it is I. So Abu Sufyan was seated before Hiraql, and Abu Sufyan's companions were seated behind Abu Sufyan. Then Hiraql called the interpreter, who would translate from Arabic to their language. Hiraql said to the interpreter, tell these people that I'm going to ask him some questions about this man claiming prophethood. If he lies, then the others must refute him. Abu Sufyan, at that time a non-Muslim, said that had he not feared that the others would refute him, he would have lied against the Prophet. Then Hiraql inquired about the ancestry of the Prophet. Is he of good ancestry? I replied, he is of good ancestry amongst us, meaning he has a noble lineage. Hiraql asked, has there been a king amongst his ancestors? I replied, no. The third question asked, do you accuse him of falsehood before he claimed prophethood, meaning did he speak lies before his claim to prophethood? I said no. He asked, who are his followers? People of high status or low status? I replied, they are of low status. He asked, are they increasing in number or dwindling? I said, no, they are increasing in number. He asked, does anyone give up his religion, meaning apostatize, being dissatisfied with it, after having embraced Islam? I replied, no. He asked, have you been at war with him? I said, yes. He asked, how did you fare? I replied, it has been between us and him. He has won and we have won. That is, victory has been shared. Then Hiraql asked, has he ever violated his covenant? I replied, no, but we have recently concluded a peace treaty, and we do not know what he is going to do about it. Hiraql asked, did anyone make the proclamation of prophethood before him? I replied, no. Then Hiraql said to his interpreter, tell him that I asked him about this prophet's ancestry, and he replied that he had the best ancestry. And this is the case with prophets, Hiraql says. They are the descendants of the noblest among their people. He says, I asked you if there had been a king amongst his ancestors. You said there had been none. If there had been a king, I would have just said that he's trying to reclaim the throne, demanding his ancestral kingdom. I asked you about his followers, whether they were people of high status or low status. You said that they were of low status, and such are the followers of prophets. I asked you whether you used to accuse him of falsehood or lying or deceit before the proclamation of prophethood, and you said you did not. So I have understood that if he has not spoken a lie before, he would not go out of his way to lie now. So that is to say, if he's not going to lie about normal matters, then a fortiori he will not lie about Allah. I asked you whether anyone renounced his religion, being dissatisfied with it after having embraced it. You replied in the negative. He says this is what Iman is like. When you have embraced it, it penetrates the heart. I asked you whether his followers were increasing or dwindling. You replied they were increasing. And this is how Iman is like until it reaches its consummation. I asked you whether you had been at war with him. And you replied that you had been at war with him, and victory has been shared between you and them. He suffered loss at your hands, and you suffered loss at his hands. This is how the prophets are tried before the final victory being theirs. I asked you whether he has ever violated his covenant. You replied in the negative, And this is how prophets behave. They never violate their covenants. I asked you whether anyone before him had made the same claim of prophethood. You replied in the negative. If anyone had made this proclamation before him, I would have thought that he is a man following, copying, imitating the ones before him. Then after that, Herakl asked, what does he enjoin upon you? Abu Sufyan says, I replied, he exhorts us to pray, to give the zakah, to show regard to kinship, and to practice chastity. Herakl says, if what you have told me about him is true, then he is certainly a prophet. I knew that there was to be a prophet to appear, but I did not think he would be among you. If I knew that I would be able to reach him, I would love to meet him. And if I had been in his presence, I would wash his feet out of reverence. His dominion will certainly extend to the place which is under my feet. Then he called for the letter of the Messenger of Allah and read it. The letter said, in the name of Allah, the Rahman Ar-Rahim, from Muhammad, the Messenger of Allah, to Herakl, the leader of Rome. Peace be to the one who follows the guidance. As for what follows, I extend to you the invitation to embrace Islam. Embrace Islam and you will have peace. Allah will grant you a double-fold reward, but if you reject, you will have the sins of your followers. And he quoted the ayah of the Quran, O people of the book, come to the word that is common between us, that we should worship none other than Allah, nor should we ascribe any partner with him, and some of us should not take as their fellows as lords other than Allah. But if they turn away, then testify that we are Muslimun. Abu Sufyan says that when Herakl finished reading the letter, noise and clamour was raised around him, and he ordered us to leave. Abu Sufyan says, I said, Ibn Abi Kabsha, referring to the Prophet, has come to wield great power. Behold, even the leader of the Rum is afraid of him. Abu Sufyan said that I continued to believe that the authority of the Prophet would triumph until Allah Jalla wa Ala entered me into Islam. So the event of this narration is happening between the truce of the Muslims and the Kuffar. When the Kuffar broke the covenant, then we had the Fathu Makkah. In this narration we find that the leader of the Rum, Herakl, was in fact a very intelligent man. Everything about him in this narration indicates to his deep thought and intelligence. Firstly, he asked for the man who is most closely related to him, because if you're most closely related to someone, you have most knowledge of him, so it makes most sense to ask such a person. So that's the first intelligent decision which Herakl makes. Secondly, he sits Abu Sufyan right and directly in front of him, staring at him in his face, almost as if to put Abu Sufyan on the spot, so that Abu Sufyan does not deviate in his answers and does not beat about the bush and just answers straight. That is another clever step to take. And Herakl ensures that Abu Sufyan does not lie, as he seats his other companions behind him, so Abu Sufyan cannot see them and cannot make eye contact with them. And he told them that if Abu Sufyan lies, then you must refute him. About the peace treaty, Abu Sufyan said that we are in a peace treaty with him, but we do not know how he will act in this peace treaty. He knows full well that the Prophet does not break his covenant and will fulfill the peace treaty. But this is the best Abu Sufyan could do to downgrade the Prophet. Notice at the end of the narration, he says, Ibn Abi Kabsha, referring to the Prophet. But that is not the kunya of the Prophet, Abu Kabsha. What does that mean? Abu Kabsha was the title given to a person who holds beliefs which are not commonly held amongst the Arab. A social outcast, if you like. Nowadays, the Kuffar could call such people extremists or non-violent extremists. So people who hold different beliefs are given these labels. It is happening today, and it happened back then as well. Herakl knew that the Prophet is going to take the land beneath his feet, and this happened not during the time of the Prophet, but during the time of the Khulafa. Notice that the questions he asks, and we will not bother repeating them here as we have mentioned them already, these questions are used to determine whether this Prophet is a genuine Prophet. Notice how Herakl does not ask about any crazy miracles that this Prophet may have performed. And this is also from his intelligence, because people performing miracles, giving life to the dead or splitting moons, does not prove anything. It just proves that he can do some amazing feats, maybe with the help of jinn perhaps, maybe it is witchcraft. It is not enough to convince the intelligent man that this person is a prophet. Rather, what Herakl asked, "That is what we need to go by. Does this man exhibit the traits and qualities of a prophet?" As the old saying goes, if it looks like a duck and quacks like a duck, it is a duck. That is to say, if something contains or exhibits the characteristics or qualities of a particular personality, then that thing is that personality, because it is your characteristics that define who you are. And every prophet has the characteristics of a prophet, and they are ascertained by those questions that Herakl asked Abu Sufyan. These miracles, if you like, supernatural wonders, at best they just reach the eye, but for you to believe in something, it needs to reach the heart. So you need something a bit more profound than just miracles. Question: if Herakl was so sure that this prophet is a genuine prophet, why did he not convert? And the answer is, because he did not want to lose his kingdom. It's something similar with Abu Talib. He knew that the prophet, his nephew, was the true prophet, yet he still did not convert. Why? Because he did not want to be seen as a traitor to the religion of Abdul Muttalib. And so this is where we say that your Iman is not just merely acknowledging something, but rather it is to acknowledge with acceptance and submission. So it is not merely iqrar, where you acknowledge or confess something. Let's take a few more points of benefit at this stage. Let it be known that when the Prophet said that the earth belongs to Allah and the Messenger, then this is indeed correct, and that it is the righteous servants of Allah Jalla wa'ala who will inherit the earth. وَلَقَدْ كَتَبْنَا فِي الزَّبُورِ مِنْ بَعْدِ الذِّكْرِ أَنَّ الْأَرْضَ يَرِثُهَا عِبَادِيَ الصَّالِحُونَ. And this is why the fate is so called. Fa'a means to return, as in فَإِنْ فَاءَتْ فَأَصْلِحُوا بَيْنَهُمَا بِالْعَدْلِ وَأَقْسِطُوا. If the party returns to obedience, then reconcile between them with justice and be just. So the wealth taken from the kuffar without a fight is called al-fay, because it has returned to its rightful owners, the righteous Muslims. We also learn of the innate treacherous nature of the Yahud, which is why they were expelled. Allah Jalla wa'ala teaches us, لَتَجِدَنَّ أَشَدَّ النَّاسِ عَدَاوَةً لِلَّذِينَ آمَنُوا الْيَهُودَ وَالَّذِينَ أَشْرَكُوا. You will find the Yahud and the Mushrikun to be harboring the most enmity against the believers. We also learn of the virtue of the Jazira, or the peninsula of the Arab, in that it is the place of the Risala, the message. It is a place where the Wahi was sent down. It is the birthplace of the Sharia al-Islamiyya, and there is only place for Islam, no other deen, which is why the Prophet wanted to eject the Jews and the Christians out of that place. We also learn that the Jazira of the Arab is for the Muslimin, not necessarily for the Arab, because you could have Christian Arab and Jewish ones, and you can have atheist Arab, and so on. They have no right to the Jazira of the Arab, and this is from a Dini standpoint of view. As for what you might find with the rulers not allowing non-Arab to stay in the Arab Peninsula, and allowing even the Kuffar Arab to stay in the Arab Peninsula, then this is their political maneuver. It has nothing to do with the deen itself, so understand the difference. Also from the narration of the Banu Qurayza, where Sa'ad ibn Mu'adh was the judge, we take that an imam can appoint people to deliver a judgment in accordance with the ijtihad. No one differs from this amongst the ulama, except the Khawarij. They differ because they are an extreme sect, and this is one of the problems they had with Ali radiallahu anh, appointing another man to be a judge. And of course Ali radiallahu anh sent Abdullah ibn Abbas to explain to them the reality of the matter, and a third of them returned back to the truth, and 2/3 did not. Because when you're too neck deep into extremism, it's not likely that you're going to return back to the truth, and that's just the reality of the matter. Sad, but true. Also from the narration of Abdullah ibn Mughaffal finding a bag of fat on the day of Khaybar. Of course, Khaybar was the place where the Yahud were, and this fat would have come from a slaughtered animal. So we may also take then that the slaughtered animals of the Yahud are permissible to be eaten. Otherwise, that bag of fat would not have been halal for Abdullah ibn Mughaffal. Also, we said that you can eat the consumables during a wartime, and this does make sense because it will give you energy to keep on fighting. But further to that, we may say that you can also use the weapons of the enemies and their riding animals, if need be,
in a war because it will aid you in fighting. And this is the majority view. And also notice the letter that the Prophet sent to Herakl, how short and concise it was. Many times people giving da'wah give a verbose lecture to the kuffar they're giving da'wah to. And it often becomes a matter of debate and discussion. There's no actual invitation involved in any of these discussions. You need to get right to the heart of the matter and invite them to the deen, first and foremost. And keep the matter short and sweet, not verbose. This is the Prophet's style. Also notice that there is no philosophical arguments. It's just a short and sweet da'wah. If they reject, fine, no problem. That's on them. We'll move on. But there is very little need of any debate.
Let's take the next chapter about the Prophet sending letters to the various rulers. Anas reports that the Prophet ﷺ wrote to Kisra, who was a ruler of Persia, to Herakl, who was the ruler of Rum, and to An-Najashi, the ruler of Abyssinia. And he wrote to every other ruler, inviting them to Allah Jalla wa Ala. And this An-Najashi is not the same Najashi whom the Prophet prayed the Salat al-Janazah over. And this is what we find the Sunnah to be. The Muslim ruler should invite other non-Muslim rulers to Islam. Because if Allah Jalla wa Ala guides them, then it could be because of their influence, the others under them will be guided too. And we read in the previous narration, the Prophet said to Herakl in his letter, if you turn away, then you will have the sin of your followers. Because the followers are just going to follow Herakl. So if he leads them astray, then he will have their sin as well. Another lesson we take from this is that just educating people about Islam is not good enough. Rather, there must be a formal invitation. If you are throwing a party, you do not just educate people about this party, you actually invite them to it. So the key word is invitation, not merely education or raising awareness. Let us take the next chapter about the Ghazwa, the military expedition of Hunayn. Al-Abbas narrates, I was with the Prophet on the day of Hunayn. I and Abu Sufyan ibn Harith ibn Abdul Muttalib stuck to the Prophet, and we did not separate from him. The Prophet was riding his white mule, which Farwa ibn Nufatha al-Judhami had given him as a gift. When the Muslims encountered the kuffar, the Muslims fled, but the Prophet began to spur his mule towards the kuffar. I was holding the bridle of the mule. The Prophet said, Abbas, call the people of Samura. So Abbas called the people of Samura with a loud voice. He says, they came back just like cows come back to their calves. They said, we are present, we are present. And they began to fight the kuffar. And then Al-Abbas called the Ansar. He says, Banu al-Harith ibn al-Khazraj were the last group to be called. The Prophet looked on to the fight with his neck stretched out, and he said, this is the time when the fight is raging hot. Then the Prophet took some pebbles and threw them in the face of the kuffar, and he said, by the Lord of Muhammad, the kuffar are defeated. Al-Abbas says, I went around and saw that the battle was in the same condition in which I had seen it. He says, by Allah, it remained in that condition until the Prophet threw the pebbles. He says, I continued to watch until I found that their force had been depleted and the kuffar began to retreat. In another narration of the same chapter, Al-Bara ibn Azib says that on the day of Hunayn, some youngsters from the Muslims marched out and they did not have any arms, or they did not have an abundant arms, so weapons. And they met some archers opposing them from the tribe of Banu Hawazin and Banu Nadir. These archers were very skilled and they never missed their target. So these young men turned to the Messenger of Allah. Whilst the Prophet was riding his white mule, the Prophet got down from his mule, invoked the help of Allah, and said, Ana nabiyyu la kadhib, ana ibnu Abdul Muttalib. I am the Prophet, that is no lie. I am the son of Abdul Muttalib. Then he gathered his men in rows to fight the Banu Hawazin. We take from these narrations that you never enter a battle without weapons, as these young fellows did. Not just weapons, but weapons that will match the weapons of your enemies. They should all be part of your preparation. And it is for this reason that when the Muslims were in Mecca for the first 13 years of the prophethood, they were not allowed to fight the mushrikeen. because they simply did not have any power to do so, and so they had to endure the suffering. We also found the Prophet recites a line of poetry, أَنَا النَّبِيُّ لَا كَذِبْ أَنَا بْنُ عَبْدِ الْمُطَّلِبِ. Does this mean that the Prophet is a poet? Well, just reciting one line of poetry does not make you into a poet. As they say, one swallow does not make a summer. Allah Jalla wa Ala says in Surah Yasin, وَمَا عَلَّمْنَاهُ الشِّعْرَ وَمَا يَنْبَغِي لَهُ. We did not teach him poetry, and neither is this possible for him. So it is not possible for the Prophet to be a poet. Likewise, Allah Jalla wa Ala says in Surah Al-Ankabut, وَمَا كُنْتَ تَتْلُو مِنْ قَبْلِهِ مِنْ كِتَابٍ وَلَا تَخُطُّهُ بِيَمِينِكَ إِذًا لَارْتَابَ الْمُبْطِلُونَ. And neither did you recite any book before it, nor did you write anything with your right hand, because in that case the followers of falsehood would have doubted you. So we find the Prophet did not know how to write nor recite before the Quran came down to him. We also find the bravery of the Prophet and his confidence in victory when many of his companions fled. The Prophet says, I am the son of Abd al-Muttalib. The Prophet is the son of Abdullah, that's the Prophet's father, who in turn is the son of Abd al-Muttalib. So Abd al-Muttalib is the Prophet's grandfather. But the Prophet uses the name of Abd al-Muttalib because Abd al-Muttalib was a leader and highly revered and respected. And so in a situation like this, a war situation where you're trying to win the psychological battle, not just the physical battle, then this would be perfectly fine. And besides, your grandfather is your father. The tribe of Banu Hawazin were situated between Mecca and Ta'if, and they had their archers camped. And it was a Saturday, 6th of Shawwal, which is right after Ramadan. The conquest of Mecca, of course, was in Ramadan. Now that time, as we know, Mecca had already been conquered. The Muslim army was large in number. Nothing like the time of Battle of Badr when they were 319, as we have come across in one of the narrations before. No, rather, today they were many thousands. And this pleased them. And they started to say that we will not be defeated due to our small number. And Allah Jalla wa Ala decided to teach them a lesson, that you do not rely upon your huge number or your military prowess. Rather, victory or defeat will come from Allah Jalla wa Ala. And so Allah Jalla wa Ala decided that at the beginning of the battle, that the Muslims should be humiliated, because they were getting too big for their shoe size because of their large number. But in the end, Allah fulfilled His promise of victory for the Muslimin. But the lesson to be learned is, no matter how large or small you are, you must remain humble and have your reliance upon Allah Jalla wa Ala totally. The next chapter speaks about the Ghazwa, the military expedition of At-Ta'if. From Abdullah ibn Amr, he says that the Prophet besieged the people of Ta'if. He surrounded them, but did not achieve victory over them. The Prophet said, Insha'Allah, we will return back to them. And his companions asked him, shall we depart without having conquered them? The Prophet said, okay, make a raid in the morning. And they did so, and they were wounded by the arrows that were showered upon them. So the Prophet said, we will return tomorrow. And now, this statement all of a sudden pleased the companions, and so the Prophet laughed. This battle of Ta'if is really just linked on or an extension to the battle of Hunain, because the enemies fled and took shelter in the fortress in Ta'if. But of course the Prophet wanted to pursue the enemies right till the end, so he came to Ta'if and they were barricaded behind the fortress, and so the Prophet could not penetrate their fortress. So he decided to come back tomorrow. Why did the Prophet laugh? Well, the Prophet knows better about these military situations and what decision to take. The Prophet said, we'll come back tomorrow. But at first, the companions did not agree. How can we just leave without having conquered them? No, we want to see this to the end. So the Prophet said, okay then, as you wish, we'll raid them in the morning. And when they did so, the plan did not work, because they were repelled by the flood of arrows coming their way. So when the Prophet suggested the same thing again, that is, we will return back to them, now all of a sudden, the companions, when they had been hurt with the arrows, they agreed. And this is what made the Prophet laugh. Look, you were not agreeing with me previously, and now, when you've seen that the decision does not work, you are agreeing with me. You could have just agreed first time round. So it's a bit like giving somebody what he asks for and then he regrets it. It's similar to the wasal, when you continue your fasting without breaking it. The Prophet did this, but he ordered his companions not to do it, because the Prophet is not like the companions when it comes to being patient over these acts of ibadah. However, the companions in their zeal wanted to make wisal. So the Prophet made wisal with them for 2 days, and then the hilal of the Shawwal appeared. And the Prophet said, لَوْ تَأَخَّرَ الْهِلَالُ لَزِدْتُكُمْ. If the hilal had been delayed, I would have made even more wisal with you. That is to teach you a lesson and to punish you not to do something which I have prohibited you from doing. So it's like the Prophet is giving them what they ask for, but it ends up being a source of regret for them. It's worth pointing out here that according to the seerah of the Prophet, the people of Ta'if embraced Islam willingly, so there was no need for any bloodshed. And it's a fitting end because at the beginning of the Prophet's prophethood career, he was given the choice by the angel of the mountains that he will make the mountains fall down on the people of Ta'if, thus crushing them. And the Prophet ﷺ kept a positive attitude. He said, perhaps from their progeny there will be those who will worship Allah Jalla wa'ala. So it's a fitting end that the people of Ta'if embraced Islam. The next chapter is about the Battle of Badr. Anas ibn Malik reports that when the news of the advancement of Abu Sufyan and his trade caravan had reached the Muslims, the Prophet consulted his companions. Abu Bakr gave his view, but the Prophet did not pay heed to him. Then Umar spoke, and the Prophet did not pay heed to his views too. Then Sa'ad ibn Ubadah stood up and said, O Messenger of Allah, you want us to speak? By Allah, if you order us to plunge our horses into the sea, we would do so. And if you order us to goad our horses to the most distant place like Barq al-Ghimad, we would do so. So they set out and encamped at the place of Badr, which is named after the well called Badr. Soon the water carriers of the Quraysh arrived. Amongst them was a black servant belonging to Banu al-Hajjaj. The companions caught him and interrogated him about Abu Sufyan. He said, I know nothing about Abu Sufyan, but Abu Jahl and Utbah and Shaybah and Umayyah ibn Khalaf are present. When he said this, the companions beat him, and then he said, okay, I will tell you about Abu Sufyan. When they stopped beating him, he said, I know nothing about Abu Sufyan, but Abu Jahl, Utbah, Shaybah and Umayyah are there. Then the companions would beat him again. The Prophet at that time was praying. When he finished his prayer, he rebuked the companions for beating him. He said, by Allah, in whose hand is my life, you beat him when he is telling you the truth, and you let him go when he tells you a lie. The Prophet said, this is the place where so-and-so will be killed. And he placed his hand on the land, saying here and here and here, pointing to the exact places where such and such a person will be killed, naming them. And that is the narration. Now the Ghazwat of Badr is well known. It is the first major battle that broke out between the Muslims and the Mushrikeen. It was in Ramadan, just like the conquest of Makkah. It was in the second year. Abu Sufyan and his trade caravan were coming from Asham up north to Makkah. The Prophet and the companions decided to help themselves to this trade caravan because the wealth and the life of the Mushrikeen was halal as they were at war with the Muslims. Now Abu Sufyan, at that time Mushrik, of course he was later to become a Muslim, but at that time he was the chief of the Mushrikeen. He knew about this threat from the Muslims and he took the alternative route by the seaside, and he sent a message to the rest of the Quraysh in Mecca for help. And the Quraysh were filled with their tribal pride, and their chiefs and their leaders gathered to go out and meet the Prophet and his companions for the battle. Allah describes how they went out. خَرَجُوا مِنْ دِيَارِهِمْ بَطَرًا وَرِئَاءَ النَّاسِ وَيَصُدُّونَ عَنْ سَبِيلِ اللَّهِ. They went out of their homes out of pride and showing off to the people and leading people astray from the path of Allah. Abu Jahl said, we will not return until we reach Badr. We will encamp there. We will slaughter the camels and we will drink wine, and the servant girls will sing for us, and all of the Arab will hear of us and they will be in awe of us. And as it so happened, the matter was completely opposite. So what happened was that the Prophet went out to meet Abu Sufyan. He did not want a war with the rest of the Quraysh, but he ended up meeting Abu Jahl and his army, whom Abu Sufyan called for. As for Abu Sufyan himself, he saved himself by taking the alternate route by the seaside or the shoreline, which the Prophet was not expecting him to take. So Abu Sufyan saved himself, leaving the Prophet and the rest of the Quraysh to face off with each other at Badr. Anyway, the upshot of it all was that the leaders of the Quraysh were killed. 70 were killed and 70 were captured. And we mentioned the narration of the two boys, Mu'adh ibn Afra and Mu'adh ibn al-Jamuh, who both went out to kill Abu Jahl. And the salab of Abu Jahl was given to Mu'adh ibn al-Jamuh. We also see the mercy of the Prophet ﷺ, who told his companions to stop beating the servant as he was speaking the truth. Otherwise, it is permissible to capture somebody from the enemies and interrogate them, because the Prophet did not rebuke the companions for capturing and interrogating. But having said that, you are not allowed to oppress anyone. The next chapter is about the conquest of Mecca. Abu Hurairah narrates that the Prophet advanced until he reached Mecca with Zubayr on his right and Khalid on the left. He dispatched Abu Ubaidah with a force that had no armor. They advanced to the interior of the valley. The Prophet was in the midst of a large contingent of fighters. He says, he saw me, and he said, O Abu Hurairah. I said, I am here at your call. The Prophet said, none should come near me except the Ansar. So call the Ansar to me. Abu Hurairah said, so they gathered around him. He says, Quraysh also gathered their ruffians and their lowly followers. The Prophet said to the Ansar, you see these ruffians and the lowly followers of Quraysh? And he indicated by striking one of his hands over the other that they should be killed, and said, meet me at As-Safa. Then we went on, and if anyone wanted that a certain person should be killed, he would be killed, and no one could resist. Abu Hurairah says, then came Abu Sufyan, and he said to the Prophet that the blood of the Quraysh has become very cheap. There will be no Quraysh from this day on. Then the Prophet said to the people, whoever enters the house of Abu Sufyan will be saved. And to this generous and forgiving attitude, the Ansar began whispering amongst themselves that the love of this city and the tenderness towards his relations, meaning from the Quraysh, has overpowered him. That's why he's being so generous to them. Abu Hurairah says that at that moment, some wahi or revelation came down to the Prophet. He says, when the Prophet would receive revelation, we would understand it and recognize that to be the case. And when he was actually receiving it, none of us would even dare raise his eyes to look at the Prophet. After, the Prophet asked the people, O assembly of the Ansar, they said, we are here. He said, you are saying that the love of this city and tenderness towards his people has overpowered this man? The Ansar admitted that to be the case. And the Prophet said, no, never. I am a servant of Allah and His Messenger. I migrated to Allah and to you. I live with you and I die with you. And the Ansar began to cry. They said, by Allah, we only said what we said because of our tenacious attachment to Allah and His Messenger. The Prophet said, surely Allah and the Messenger believe you and forgive you. So what happened was that the people turned to the house of Abu Sufyan and locked themselves in. The Prophet made tawaf of the Kaaba. He reached near an idol which used to be worshipped by the side of the Kaaba, and the Prophet pierced the eyes of the idol with his bow and recited the ayah, the truth has come and the falsehood has perished. The falsehood was always going to be perished. And then he went and climbed Mount Safa and began to raise his hands in dua, and he made dua for whatever Allah wanted him to make dua. And the narration ends. The conquest of Mecca was in the 8th year, also in Ramadan, just like the Battle of Badr, and it happened because the Quraysh broke the peace treaty of Al-Hudaybiyah. The narration for that is coming up. And the way the Quraysh broke that treaty is that they helped their allies against the allies of the Prophet. So it's a case of, if you attack me, you have broken the treaty with me. But if you attack my allies, you have also broken the treaty with me. So that is the way that the Quraysh broke the treaty. The Prophet asks in this narration that the Ansar should be with him. And this is because the Prophet wants to test their loyalty. Previously, in the Battle of Badr narration, you'll remember that the Prophet did not pay heed to the opinion of Abu Bakr and Umar. Rather, he wanted to know what the Ansar were saying about marching out to meet the trade caravan of Abu Sufyan. This is because the loyalty of Abu Bakr and Umar is known. He does not need to check their loyalty, but he does need to check the loyalty of the Ansar. And it's the same case with the conquest of Mecca as well. This is why he wanted the Ansar to be with him. Also notice the perfect etiquettes that the companions had towards the Prophet. When he was receiving the revelation, they would lower their heads and they would not even dare look at him. Just look at the humility, the humbleness before their Prophet and before the event of the revelation. The Prophet says whoever enters the house of Abu Sufyan is saved. In other narrations he also says whoever enters his house and closes the door, he will be safe. So there will be no raiding of homes. He said whoever enters the masjid, he will be safe. The Ansar found this to be strange. He's showing them mercy. Why would he want to do this? He said maybe the love for this city and the tenderness towards his near kindred has overpowered him and is influencing his decision. But this is not the case, because in matters of warfare you cannot allow your own emotions and tenderness towards a particular city or a people to influence your decisions. So Allah Jalla wa Ala told him about the rumors that were spreading amongst the people, that this is what they are saying, and the Prophet corrected them. But as the companion said,
that they were fearing that the Prophet will decide to remain in Mecca, his hometown, where he was born and bred, and will forsake Medina. To which the Prophet ﷺ clarified to them and allayed their fears. We'll continue with the Battle of Mecca, but for the time being let's just take a few more points of benefit before wrapping up this track. Notice in the Battle of Hunayn, when the companions fled, we find that Al-Abbas and Abu Sufyan remained with the Prophet. And this is interesting because the Shia do not like Abu Sufyan, and yet we find here Abu Sufyan sticks by the Prophet even though he had just recently embraced Islam, because he embraced after the conquest of Mecca. And so this is a fadila of Abu Sufyan and of Al-Abbas as well, in refutation to the Shia who dislike Abu Sufyan radiallahu anhu. Also notice something interesting at the Battle of Hunayn. The Prophet is riding a donkey. This is most strange. You do not normally ride donkeys in a war. It's normally horses and camels. The point about a donkey is that it's difficult to flee away from a battle on a donkey. It's easy to do that with a camel or a horse, but not so much with a donkey. So it's as if to say that the Prophet is giving off this idea or this message that he is going to stay and he's not running away. Also, from the Battle of Hunayn as well, we may take that the soldiers may recite lines of poetry or sing something or utter some kind of motto to bolster their spirits. This is where the Prophet said, I am a prophet, no lie, I am the son of Abd al-Muttalib. This is to bolster his spirits and the spirits of those who are following him. Also in the story of the Battle of Badr, when the companions were beating this boy from Banu Hajjaj, we may take that it is permissible to beat a kafir even if he is a prisoner of war, if we want to extract some information from him. But then this leads to an important question. If you torture a person and he gives a confession, then can we act on this confession? Or is it the case that he only confessed because he was being tortured and that he is actually innocent? The ulama differed here. Some say yes, we take him to account. Others said no, we cannot accept his confession. The Shafi'iyah have somewhat of a middle opinion. They say we will accept his confession if he sticks to it and does not rescind. Because it could be that he confesses because of the torture, but then afterwards he recants his confession. If that's the case, then according to the Shafi'iyah, we would not take him to account on the basis of his confession. From the Fath Makkah, we can take that you're allowed to enter Makkah without the ihram if you do not wish to perform the Hajj or the Umrah. And this is the correct view. We also take that Makkah was conquered by force. It was not by reconciliation and by coming to a peace agreement. No, it was by force. Okay, at this stage, let's take some review questions. So question number 1. Is it permissible to consume food which you find from the enemies during a war? Prove your answer with evidence. Question number 2. In order to ascertain whether the Prophet is actually a prophet, Hiraql asked Abu Sufyan a series of 10 questions, and he explained his justification as to why he asked those 10 questions, and he asked after that a further question. Recall all those questions. Question number 3. What evidence do we have that you do not need to be in a state of ihram if you enter Makkah without intending to perform the Hajj or the Umrah?